Iga porave. Iku bloi po rusula rusu. Holaka holala. Halagu
Howdy, welcome back to Film And. I am Dan, your host, and it is a cold, blustery day here in Burlington. It's about the best way I can describe it. And I'm excited to be here with the second installment of my Peter Jackson tier list. And now we enter the second phase of his career, which is pretty much 1999 to 2014. And, well, where we last left off, Peter Jackson had been secured the rights to one of the most coveted works of fantasy in all of history, The Lord of the Rings, and this, as most of us know, would go on to be a game changer in his career. So, I guess, where can I start off? I mean, this is a very interesting moment for Peter Jackson, for the cinema global community in general. But I guess I'll start with a little backstory on the film rights of Lord of the Rings itself. I found it kind of interesting that much like The One Ring, the film rights passed through the hands of studio to studio. No one was ever really able to make it a complete and honest adaptation of the text. I mean, many of these attempts resulted in unproduced scripts, concept art, or just an animated short. But there was always a strong interest in the idea of making the films, you know? I mean, and very different directors from around the world were interested. Some names you might recognize, like Kubrick and Antonioni, and even George Lucas. The rights, I believe in the 70s, were briefly leased to a Czech film company, Rembrandt Films, before being sold perpetually to United Artists. And in 1976, United Artists passed the rights and a partial right to The Hobbit to Fantasy Films. And finally, in 1977, an animated version of The Hobbit was produced as a TV special by Rankin and Bass, who you might know famously from Rudolph and Frosty and all those animated films of the 50s, 60s, 70s. And for reference, this is the version of The Hobbit I personally grew up on, and I still hold to this day that it is pretty much the definitive cinematic version of The Hobbit, but more on that later. Quickly following up, in 1978, famed animator Ralph Bakshi actually made a feature of the first half of The Lord of the Rings. So basically, I think it's about the first book and a half of the trilogy. And while it was pretty profitable, the film did not make enough money to automatically warrant the sequel, which would close out the rest of the story. And an argument with producer Saul Zaentz led Bakshi to abandon the project. And then Rankin and Bass came back in 1980, and they did an animated TV adaptation of The Return of the King, basically finishing up the trilogy. And at the time that Bakshi's film aired in theaters, a teenager named Peter Jackson had not read the book, but heard the name and went to see the film. And he's talks about how he liked the early part and had some quaint sequences of Hobbiton, a creepy encounter with the Black Rider on the road, and quite a few good battle scenes. But then, about halfway through, the storytelling became very disjointed and disorienting, and I really didn't understand what was happening going on. However, what it did do was make me want to read the book, if only to find out what happened. So Jackson bought the book and later read The Hobbit and The Silmarillion, which is, I think, a sign of a true Tolkien fan, because The Silmarillion, that thing is basically like half history textbook, half language translator, and half like Beowulf-esque epic fantasy poem. So it's a hell of a read. I only ever got like a third of the way through in high school. That thing is dense, man, I swear. But let's bring it back to Peter Jackson. In the late 90s, with the rights to The Hobbit being split between Saul Zaentz and United Artists, Jackson initially agreed on a 2-part film series. He began writing the scripts with his partner, Fran Walsh, and also Steven Sinclair. And meanwhile, Weta Digital began software development for the digital effects that were required for the film. And eventually, Sinclair was dropped from the project, but Jackson felt that some of his contributions survived into the finished scripts, particularly the middle film, The Two Towers. And he is actually credited accordingly in The Two Towers for story and screenplay and stuff. So eventually efforts with the initial production company Miramax fell through, and Jackson turned to New Line Cinema, which was supportive of the idea of a trilogy, which is, I think, something he was more interested in to begin with. So with this in mind, more scripting of the films continued. And it should be noted that Jackson and Walsh did not write each film to correspond exactly to its respective book. They opted kind of instead to write a 3-part adaptation with some sequences missing, some created from scratch, and some just moved from one area to another regardless of its placement in the books. And basically, this is kind of an idea to allow the story to be clearer for viewers, and Jackson took a more chronological approach to the story, rather than Tolkien's complex interlacing of storylines, which is something I guess we'd see more in fantasy shows like Game of Thrones down the road. And even during shooting, the screenplays continued to evolve, in part due to contributions from cast members themselves who were kind of looking to further explore their characters. So 1997 rolled along, and the world of Middle-earth started to become a reality, but it wasn't until November of 97 that the movies would secure their most important asset, in my opinion. Because in November of 97, famed Tolkien illustrators Alan Lee and John Howe joined the project. And most of the imagery in the films is based on their various illustrations. And I think this is truly the point where people could start to understand the potential that these films were having. Because having the original illustrators of Tolkien's films on board to consult and help create the world of Middle-earth elevated these films to a level I don't think they would have reached without them. So 1997 came and went, 98 the same, and it wasn't until October 11th of 1999 that the Lord of the Rings trilogy started filming. And mind you, all 3 films were shot in one long production block. So they filmed all the way until December of 2000. So during all of this, Weta Digital developed new technologies to allow for the groundbreaking digital effects used in the trilogy, including the development of software to generate intelligent crowds for battle scenes, and advancing kind of the art of motion capture. And this is, motion capture is probably one of the things this trilogy is best known for when it comes to visual effects. And with Jackson's future films, motion capture came to be pushed so far that it became referred to as digital makeup. Although it was later clarified that during The Lord of the Rings, it was fairly reliant on the CG animators rather than the motion capture. And each film had the benefit of a full year of post-production time before its respective December release, because they were released December 2001, 2002, and 2003. And they would often finish the film in October or November, with the crew immediately going to work on the next film. And by the time The Fellowship of the Ring had been released, assembly cuts of the other 2 films, 4.5 hours each, were already prepared. So in total, the entire production and filming of this movie was 1,800 kilometers, or 6 million feet of film, which was edited down to 11 hours and 26 minutes of the extended running time. And while all of this madness was going on, Peter Jackson would find time to take 6 weeks in London, a year, and actually 12 weeks in the case of Two Towers, to supervise the scoring process with composer Howard Shore, who was already a very accomplished composer. Before his work on Lord of the Rings, he had already scored notable films like Videodrome, a Cronenberg film, Scorsese's After Hours, Big, Silence of the Lambs, Mrs. Doubtfire, Philadelphia, Seven, and Gangs of New York, which I believe he did in tandem with Fellowship. And after, he'd go on to do The Aviator, The Departed, and Hugo. So overall, he's a very big collaborator with Scorsese. And he also, fun fact, he did Twilight Eclipse, which I thought was a cool little fact to add, that he also did the 3rd Twilight movie. And a big part of Howard Shore's method with the trilogy was creating individual themes for each character, as well as various cultures and even geographical areas of the film, and kind of lacing them throughout various corresponding scenes. And I do just love how him and Peter Jackson are able to play with score in this film, because hearing the Shire theme over Sam and Frodo's ascent to Mount Doom is like this heart-wrenching moment, and it also just reminds me, at least, that these movies are also very lacking, if not for the magnificent score. The music does so much to create this world. And another part of these films kind of being as legendary as they are is because they seem like such a cohesive trilogy. And yes, it helps that they were filmed all at the same time, but they also all have their own sense to them, their own emotional through line. And if you look at the main, above-the-line workers of the film, the director, the producers, the writers, the unit managers, they're all the same one person throughout the entire trilogy. You know, people don't change positions from movie to movie. It's the same people, except for one position: editor. Each film of the trilogy has a different editor. You have John Gilbert for Fellowship, Michael Holton for Two Towers, and Jamie Selkirk for Return of the King. And I think this is really smart, because not only can Peter Jackson potentially bop around to 3 editing booths while the trilogy is all in simultaneous post-production, it allows just enough variance to not make the films feel like a homogeneous mess. Like if the entire trilogy felt or looked exactly like Fellowship or Two Towers or Return of the King, I don't think they'd stand out as much as like one series. Because with each film, you're seeing a new area of Middle-earth and a slightly different interpretation of the flow to the story. And I think that really does a lot with it being kind of a very subconscious and unnoticeable difference, you know? And I'm going to assume we all know how this story ends, but by the end of its theatrical run, the Lord of the Rings trilogy made a total of $2.99 billion at the global box office. And it turned Peter Jackson from a curious bright spot in New Zealand to a household name around the globe and one of the most successful directors of all time. And it is the accomplishment of a lifetime. And if you haven't figured it out at this point, I'll spell it out. All 3 of these movies are a Y tier. Yabba dabba doo. Hell yeah to these movies. I just rewatched these, and it was fantastic. And I watched the theatrical cut for this episode. I wanted to see how the theatrical movies stood up, essentially, to the extended cuts, which I grew up watching. And I'll be honest, the extended versions are better. I know they're long. I know they're 12 hours. It would take you half a day. But, like, they're just better, you know? And I gotta be honest, if you have the chance, watch the extended versions. You know, the cinematic gets the story across, but you lose a lot of things. But that's my little rant about the extended versions. Moving on. If you do live under a rock, as I know some of our listeners might do, and no shade to those people under rocks, especially because rocks already provide plenty of shade, but here's a quick summary of The Lord of the Rings. Set in the fictional world of Middle-earth, the films follow the Hobbit Frodo Baggins as he and the Fellowship embark on a quest to destroy the One Ring to ensure the destruction of its maker, the Dark Lord Sauron. The Fellowship eventually splits up, and Frodo continues the quest with his loyal companion Sam and the treacherous Gollum. Meanwhile, Aragorn, heir in exile to the throne of Gondor, along with Legolas, Gimli, Boromir, Merry and Pippin, other hobbits, and the wizard Gandalf, they unite to save the free peoples of Middle-earth from the forces of Sauron and rally them in the War of the Ring to aid Frodo by distracting Sauron's attention. And it's tough for me to accurately capture what these films are, but they are nothing if not deeply immersive. The world building and practical set design paired with insane VFX considering it was done in Windows 98 remains kind of nearly unparalleled. And I think part of it does have to do with the fact that the software developed for the film and the VFX work done was under the idea that the entire film was shot in genuine 35mm film. I mean, it is one of the last big budget films or film trilogies shot on film before the dawn of digital filmmaking took the industry by storm. And why not? It is so much cheaper and way more accessible than film will ever be. But digital effects on a digitally shot film, I think, leads to a bit of a lack of realism, I guess. I mean, nothing seems as grounded to begin with digital filmmaking, and it's extra polished and clean, and slapping VFX on top sometimes doesn't help that either. And I think we've definitely seen advancements in this in recent years. I mean, look at Denis Villeneuve's past films like Dune. But as the rise of digital film gained traction in the underground in the 90s, and real film stock shot films began to be phased out, except for, the picky few who had the mastery of the form and were also powerful enough or relevant enough to keep it alive for themselves, this is very much in a dying medium in a sense. So having that factor blended into the creative process of Lord of the Rings, I think partly contributes to the trilogy's staying power. And also why people tend to criticize the Hobbit trilogy being a digitally shot and visually affected film. And, I would analyze and go in depth about Lord of the Rings more, but there's so much movie. It's hard to do it justice, and with other films like Bad Taste or The Frighteners, it's easier to just go scene by scene, character by character. But if I can just attempt right now to do some truncated thoughts on Lord of the Rings, I love the use of music, the set design, and classic artistry that not only looks appropriate, but also accurately aged and faded. I love the casting. I'm never taken out by seeing someone who looks iconic for anything else, because it truly feels like the people in these films that's what they're known for, is being in this movie. And for good reason. I mean, this is a great trilogy. My one exception is perhaps Hugo Weaving, who's been in a lot, as well as The Matrix, like right before this trilogy. So that's kind of funny to see sometimes, but it doesn't take me out of it. He is totally Elrond. The screenplay deviates from the story structure as previously mentioned, but it's completely for the better. And again, Peter Jackson is so good as a director. Particularly here, he continued to showcase that he never forgets what he's done previously, and he's not afraid to take inspiration from his past work, and in this case, improve upon basically all of it. The grand helicopter shots of New Zealand that we saw in Heavenly Creatures, or the Orc and Uruk-hai armies reminiscent of the practical makeup and gruesome horror of, like, Bad Taste or Brain Dead. The Ghost Army in Return of the King as an improvement on the VFX of The Frighteners. It all just comes together so well. And there's this sense of wonder as well. Something he touched on in Heavenly Creatures, where the films are really going the extra mile to create a cinematic experience and not slowing down for the audience at times. We are given nearly a dozen different languages in the film, references to thousands of years of history we have never lived, reestablished prejudices and relationships between cultures, and all in a script that somehow keeps your attention exactly on the main story of the Fellowship. Geez, I can't even imagine what this script looked like on paper. I know it's out there, but I couldn't have made heads or tails of it for sure. But you know what? I didn't need to. Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh needed to. And they really did do something special here in creating arguably the greatest film trilogy of all time. And you've got some great competition there when you're talking about best trilogies. What do we have? We have The Godfather, Nolan's Batman, Raimi's Spider-Man, Raimi's Evil Dead, Back to the Future, Star Wars, Linklaters Before Sunrise, Fistful of Dollars, Ocean's 11, just to name a few. And I think I would put Lord of the Rings above them all, honestly, because it really is in its own camp of fantasy. And I will say a lot of that can be contributed to the man himself, J.R.R. Tolkien, a very talented writer. So I imagine it's about time to take a PSA break, but before we get there, I wanted to finish this portion off on Lord of the Rings with some of my favorite trivia facts about the trilogy, its production, its crew, and its cast. And these fun facts don't just, I think, add to the experience watching the films, but they also show the amazing amount of forethought and genius and also community that went into making these films, and how Walsh and Jackson really were the best ones to make this trilogy. And all the interesting things about the making of The Lord of the Rings is also in the making of documentaries, which are all uploaded on YouTube. And if you're listening to the YouTube version right now, I will link the playlist below. So here we go. Fun facts. Sir Christopher Lee, who plays Saruman, read Lord of the Rings once a year until his death in 2015, and had done so since the year it was published. And he was also the only member of the cast and crew to have ever met J.R.R. Tolkien in person. Stanley Kubrick once considered directing a Lord of the Rings adaptation, and ironically, his death indirectly allowed Peter Jackson to get the cast he wanted. Ian McKellen and Cate Blanchett were going to appear in Minority Report, which is one of Spielberg's films. That's what he was planning to do in 2000. But Kubrick's death caused director Steven Spielberg to delay that movie and make AI, artificial intelligence, instead. Because if you don't know, AI, the first half of Steven Spielberg's AI, artificial intelligence, is just essentially Kubrick's shot-for-shot plan of making it, but he died before he was able to. And when he was talking to the studios when Kubrick was dying, he's like, I trust one guy to make this movie if I don't make it, and it's Spielberg. So Spielberg pushed Minority Report, which was going to have McKellen and Blanchett, and he made AI instead. So they missed out on Minority Report, But then we got an amazing Galadriel and Gandalf, so that was cool. Director Peter Jackson gave one of the rings used in the movie to Elijah Wood and one to Andy Serkis as a gift when the shoot was finished, and they both thought that they had the only one. He didn't tell them that he gave one to each of them. Okay, this is a favorite of mine. The cast often had to fly to remote shoot locations by helicopter, and Sean Bean, who plays Boromir, was afraid of flying and would only do it when absolutely necessary. And when they were shooting the scenes of the Fellowship crossing the snowy mountains, he'd spent 2 hours every morning climbing from the base of the mountain to get to set at the top, already dressed as Boromir, and the crew being flown up could see him from their helicopters. Okay, next. Originally, the narration at the prologue was meant to be spoken by Elijah Wood, who plays Frodo, but it was felt that the information imparted had little bearing on the character of Frodo, and then they had Ian McKellen also record a narration, but once again it felt that Gandalf wasn't the right character to speak it. Neither he nor Frodo were present at the events described in the prologue. So eventually they settled on Cate Blanchett as Galadriel, as it emphasizes the timelessness of the elves, which, oh my goodness, that is a genius point, and I didn't even realize it until now, but that's just so perfect. Next, when Pippin is being hit with the apples after asking about second breakfast, it is Viggo Mortensen actually chucking the apple at his head, and they had to shoot the scene 16 times to get it just right, and Billy Boyd says he believes Mortensen really enjoyed himself immensely. And yes, we have officially reached the Viggo Mortensen portion of the fun facts, and there are many. First, Viggo Mortensen, who plays Aragorn, who is trilingual in English, Spanish, and Danish, requested the script be revised to let Aragorn speak more of his lines in Elvish. Second, Viggo Mortensen purchased Alwyn's horse after production and gave it to Liv Tyler's riding double, Jane Abbott, which is so cool. Third, Viggo Mortensen did his own stunts. He also insisted on using only a real steel sword instead of a significantly lighter aluminum sword, or safer rubber sword, which were manufactured for battle scenes and stunts. Fourth, veteran swordmaster Bob Anderson called Viggo Mortensen the best swordsman I've ever trained. Fifth, Viggo Mortensen kept his sword with him at all times off set so that he could remain in character. He was questioned several times by police after reviewing his training sessions with the sword and being spotted by members of the public. Okay, number 6. Viggo Mortensen chipped a tooth while filming a fight sequence. He wanted Peter Jackson to super glue it back on so he could finish his scene, but Jackson took him to the dentist on his lunch break, had it patched up, and returned to the set that afternoon. And that was a fun little section of Viggo facts. Next up, Liv Tyler accidentally stabbed herself in the right thigh when filming the "If You Want Him, Come and Claim Him" sequence in Fellowship. Every actor and actress in this movie wore a wig apart from one actor, Billy Jackson, who is Peter Jackson's toddler son, seen listening wide-eyed to a tale told by Bilbo Baggins at his birthday party. And the explanation for this is because Billy Jackson had perfect Hobbit hair, and that's awesome. He's very cute in the movie. Another good one. The Scream of the Ringwraiths is actually co-writer and co-producer Fran Walsh. She voices the Ringwraiths, or at least their scream, and I think that's pretty cool. In the entirety of the trilogy, this is an insane fact. In the entirety of the trilogy, Legolas speaks only 5 words to Frodo, and "You have my bow." And that's in Fellowship when they're talking about coming forward to help Frodo carry the ring. And it could even be argued that these words were aimed at the entire council and not just at Frodo. So there's a chance, like, if you look at it that way, Legolas never speaks to Frodo for the entire trilogy, which is insane to think about, but it's true. And I will cut myself off there. We will take a quick PSA break and return with the next directorial effort of Peter Jackson.
Running late to class but still need that morning caffeine or hot breakfast to start your day out right? Download the Bite app by Sodexo and place your custom order for fast, easy pickup at Zyme. Open 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Mondays through Fridays.
All right, welcome back to Film and we are on the second part of our Peter Jackson tier list, and we have just finished up a mammoth discussion of 3 movies, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I don't want to spend so long on such a well-established movies, but how can you not, you know? I know people complain about the extended versions combining up to like 12 hours, so you can really only do justice talking about these movies in long form, because there's so much, and trying to discuss everything is impossible anyways, unless you want to talk for as long as the movie's runtime is. So we're moving on. It's 2004. Return of the King has just won 11 of the 11 Oscars it was nominated for, including Best Picture. Peter Jackson is sitting on top of the most critically acclaimed film trilogy of all time, and he can really just go anywhere he wants from here. And I read a blurb about what it was like to make successful movies from the book Making Movies by Sidney Lumet, and this is something that's actually stuck with me ever since. I love this. He talks about his successful run of films in the 70s, and if you don't know Sidney Lumet, probably his biggest credits are Dog Day Afternoon and the original 12 Angry Men. And he says in his book, and I'm paraphrasing, if you make a hit, you're a director of interest. If you're able to make another hit movie right after, you're on a hot streak. And if you make 3 in a row, you can make whatever the hell you want. And this is true now of Peter Jackson's position. I mean, it seems he goes the route of anyone who's achieved a level of industry popularity at this point. And we've honestly seen some very similar examples to this past year in movies, like Lin-Manuel Miranda's Tick, Tick, Boom or Spielberg's West Side Story. Peter Jackson goes on to make a film that was deeply impactful on his youth, and it's one that we've mentioned early on in this tier list. King Kong, the 1933 classic film about a giant monkey climbing on some buildings in New York, just being misunderstood, wanting to go back home on Skull Island. He can fight his T-Rexes and his lizard monsters. Now, we've seen this pop up plenty of times in his career. Actually, he paid direct homage to the film by including Skull Island as the origin for the Sumatran devil monkey in his film Braindead. And in the 90s, after Universal was impressed with Jackson's work on The Frighteners, he was offered Creature from the Black Lagoon, but he declined. And then they learned of his love of King Kong, and with the character of the ape being in the public domain, he first declined before being quoted saying, "I quickly became disturbed by the fact that someone else would take King Kong over," Jackson continued, "and make it into a terrible film. That haunted me, and I eventually said yes to Universal." Now, it was put on the back burner before the aforementioned trilogy until finally the dust settled for at least a little, and Jackson resumed work on it. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the most iconic notes about this film. The writers chose to base the new screenplay on the 1933 film rather than the original 1996 script that they had been working on before the trilogy. They also included scenes from James Ashmore Creelman's 33 screenplay that were either abandoned or omitted during production of the original film. And as much as Lord of the Rings is what Jackson is most known for, it stands very much as an outlier in his filmography, as tonally Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are very different from his other works. And this is really me trying to say that King Kong, like anything, feels like a genuine return to form, and it makes much more sense in the context of the first leg of his career. It's a horrifying monster action movie with similarities to his splatter era, but with a giant budget for impressive CGI and huge blockbuster performances. And I do consider this era of his career his blockbuster era, as it consists of 2 trilogies and 2 standalone films. And one of those standalone films is King Kong. And to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the original 1933 King Kong. I mean, I can respect its iconic effects for creating Kong, and the creatures of Skull Island, but the pretty, I guess, inexcusable depiction of island natives and a pretty weak screenplay at times, and just the overall schlocky nature of the original film can't really save it. You know, I don't really ever need to rewatch this. I don't think it's as amazing as people lift it up to be. Obviously, the King Kong effects are cool, and that ending scene is very solid. I do love any scene that's also just Ann Darrow and Kong together in that film, because it kind of shows, you know, more the depth of the character of King Kong. I think that's cool. But overall, this film is kind of just better when you skip to the good parts. I never really need to watch any other scenes other than the iconic ones. And even though I think Jackson improved on the original a little bit, my take on the original film kind of transfers as well onto Jackson's version. I mean, with how ambitious this film is, there's a lot of CGI that, personally, I don't think really pans out with how they executed it. And that's even despite the T-Rex fight being on like every Best Buy TV screen for a decade straight, and people very much uplifting this as a huge accomplishment in CG. And it's also, I think, a point to say that the actors' talents feel definitely underutilized and squandered with the amount of interactions they need to have with non-existing characters, like Adrian Brody, who is a favorite of mine, plus Naomi Watts, and even Jack Black to an extent, who just kind of feels like a weird casting here. And I'll say it, the 1933 version is an hour and 40 minutes, so there's no reason at all, at least for me, that this film needs to be 3 hours and 7 minutes long. I mean, seriously. I mean, plus there's an extended version that adds 15 minutes to it, and this thing is indeed a slog to get through at times, and sadly I never find myself caring about the story enough to sit through it, despite the couple of fun scenes I enjoy rewatching, And, I also kind of find myself comparing it to the grandiose moments of Lord of the Rings and how cinematic it feels, and I can't help but feel that turning something like King Kong into like this deeply emotional and grand storytelling film doesn't really do my perception of the King Kong narrative justice. But again, that's just kind of me. So I give King Kong a V tier for very average. Not amazing, certainly not terrible. And I guess, now we've made it to the mid-2000s, and at this point in Jackson's career, he really is free to just go on and do anything. And next up is, I think, a really interesting inclusion in the filmography of Peter Jackson, and one I might say that is the most outlier than any of his previous films, and easily the most outlier from the other 7 movies in the second phase of his career. 2009's The Lovely Bones. And I feel like I can't give a summary of this one because the major plot point just feels like such a good reveal in the beginning of the film. I don't want to spoil it, but if I have to say anything moving forward, I'm just going to say big spoiler for The Lovely Bones, which, if you've read the book that it's adapted from, this is not a spoiler, but whatever, you have been warned. The story follows Susie, who's a 14-year-old aspiring photographer in the early 70s, played by a very young and prolific Saoirse Ronan, who ends up being murdered by her neighbor and is trapped in a sort of paradise-esque purgatory, and she fights to watch over her family and her murderer. And the film feels like a real return to form in the sense that it almost feels like an expansion on the themes of, I guess, the poetic narrative visuals of heavenly creatures. And this is a story not dissimilar to that one either, except this time around, the digital effects of Weta have turned Jackson's creative work into something more polished and more similar to his blockbuster budget effects, because this thing was like a $63 million budget. And I can safely say a lot of that definitely went to the CGI. I mean, it's very beautiful and sensitive. It's very much melodramatic at times, but never to the point where it's at the expense of the story. It's got some pretty intriguing performances as well. Mark Wahlberg is in it, which again feels like a very weird casting, but he honestly drops a pretty alright performance. He plays Saoirse Ronan's father, who's obsessed with the crime. You have Susan Sarandon as his alcoholic, wisecracking mother-in-law who stays to help. And then Stanley Tucci as the neighbor, as the murderer. I swear is like the creepiest creeper I've ever seen. And he plays it perfectly. I'll say that. I do like how Peter Jackson, and this is probably Paul the novel as well, I like how he shows the lengths that Stanley Tucci's character goes to cover up the murder, and he continues to follow him throughout the film. I feel like not enough movies dive deep into like the murderers when a murder happens. I mean, oftentimes, at least with what I've seen, they're a mystery that just gets unwrapped or revealed at the end, like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Or they're like Jokerified, like Jared Leto in The Little Things, and it's more just about like how weird can this movie make them seem and how crazy is their performance. But I mean, here it's a grounded person, and I think that's where the horror comes in, I mean, it's the fact that Stanley Tucci's character is just a human person completely capable of being this methodical killer, and how it doesn't even show to the public. And I think that's definitely one of the stronger aspects of this film. And I feel like also one thing I've learned about watching so many movies now, because I've seen like, I think like 1,100 movies up to this point since April 2019. I know lockdown helped with that, but I've seen so many. But, I mean, one thing I've learned is that it can just be the smallest things that can make a difference or an impact with a movie. And in this case, it's the production design. It's the set design. There's something that's very tangible about it, that's very real. Like the cabinet handles in the main family's kitchen. This is such a random thing I noticed, but they're exactly like the 70s handles that are in my grandparents' house that they used to have. And it was insane because there's this scene around the midpoint when Susan Sarandon is confronting her daughter about her not coping with her daughter's death, and she's rummaging around looking for cooking sherry to drink because she's an alcoholic, and she's slamming the drawers, and I'm like, wait, I know those handles. And it's like, it's a weird moment, and I do wonder if anyone else connects to movies in that way, with just like, you know, the minute production design details that, I don't know, it just really makes it an enjoyable experience when things like that pop up. And also, I mean, not to just dive too deep into the story, but like, what does Peter Jackson have to say on the matter, especially on production design and set design? Because in discussions on the overall like concept of this film and I guess its depiction from the book, he explained that he enjoyed the novel because he found it curiously optimistic and uplifting because of the narrator's sense of humor, and adding that there was a difference between its tone and its subject matter. And he felt very few films dealt with the loss of a loved one in this way. It's something he connected with personally. And Jackson foresaw the most challenging element of the novel to adapt was probably the portrayal of Susie, the protagonist, in her, not heaven, but kind of like purgatory area, the in-between, as kind of her younger brother calls it in the film, and kind of making it ethereal and emotional, but not hokey. And I can understand that's a very thin line to tread, and he treads it very carefully in this film. And Saoirse Ronan explained that Jackson chose to depict the afterlife as depending on Susie's emotions. Whenever Susie feels happy, heaven, as she calls it, is sunny and there's birds and everything. And whenever it's not so great, it's raining or she's in the middle of an ocean. And Jackson described the book's depiction of heaven as being the in-between rather than a true heaven, and said he was not trying to point like a definitive picture of what heaven is itself. Which, yeah, I get it for this story. And another cool fact is that the score was actually done by Brian Eno. I mean, taking tracks and demos from his entire career and reworking them, updating them to fit the tone and the narrative. And Fran Walsh, actually, you know, Peter Jackson's partner, producer, recommended him for the film. And Jackson was surprised since Eno does kind of have that reputation of not wanting to work in films. But overall, I don't think it's Eno's most powerful work. I mean, obviously, I think it serves the narrative pretty well, but, you know, Eno's name in my head is associated with other sonic landscapes, particularly a lot of his work in the 70s, but I guess that's kind of my own biases that it feels a bit disjointed here. But overall, I give Lovely Bones a W tier for worth a watch. I mean, it's one of my favorite Mark Wahlberg performances, I guess. And overall, cool, again, expansion on the ideas played with in Heavenly Creatures. Though I think I may like Heavenly Creatures just a tad more. But moving on. Next up, another trilogy of Tolkien adaptations, The Hobbit. But let's rewind a couple years to 2006. Fresh off the release of King Kong, and may I remind you, only 3 years after Return of the King's release and 2 years after its winning of Best Picture, a letter from Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh stated that due to an ongoing legal dispute between Wignut Films, which is Jackson's production company, and New Line Cinema, Jackson would not be directing a Hobbit film. And New Line Cinema's head, Robert Shea, commented that Jackson will never make any movie with New Line Cinema again while I'm still working at the company. And this actually prompted an online call for a boycott of New Line, and by August 2007, Shea was desperately trying to repair his working relationship. So in December 2007, it was announced that Jackson and New Line had reached an agreement to make 2 prequels, both based on The Hobbit, and to be released in 2012 and 2013 with Jackson as a writer and producer and having Guillermo del Toro directing. But as we know, this is not a Guillermo del Toro tier list. This is a Peter Jackson tier list. And in early 2010, del Toro dropped out due to production delays, and a month later, Jackson was back in negotiations, and by October, he was finalized as a director. So, a year into filming, Jackson announced that the 2 planned Hobbit movies would be expanded into a trilogy, and he said that the third film would not act as a bridge between The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings films, but he would continue to expand the Hobbit story by using material found in the Lord of the Rings appendices. And folks, this is where I find myself very much conflicted, because at best, Jackson's Hobbit trilogy is worth a watch, but they all fall distance from the Lord of the Rings films we know. And I would love to say that they all rank the same for me, but I don't think they do. They're not. I mean, Jackson's Hobbit trilogy, in my eyes, and may I remind you, I do stand by the 70s animated Hobbit, should have been 2 movies, and 2 movies only, you know? You end the first movie with Bilbo getting to the Lonely Mountain or something, and the second movie is Smaug and the Battle of the Five Armies, and that's all it needs to be. Because there is a lot of book, but I don't think it's 3 movies worth of book, you know? And what confounds me, too, is that, many interviews for Lord of the Rings, Jackson talks about how he made sure to cut out scenes and characters from the book that didn't somehow revolve around the single storyline of those films. Frodo carrying the ring, it's all about that in some way. But here, with a franchise set up sort of as a prequel, so much additional things, like the Pale Orc storyline and Gandalf's search for the Necromancer, just kind of seem utterly useless in the actual, main plot of Bilbo going to Lonely Mountain. But I don't know, my appeal to the Hobbit book is that it feels like it's truly Bilbo's story, through and through, and I love his honest, simple Hobbit perspective, and, that shines through so well in the animated version, but in this trilogy, it definitely feels a bit lost, which is sad to say, and this is where I personally come into the story, because I was actually able to see these in theaters growing up, and they weren't that bad. Upon rewatches and some thinking over things, I kind of tiered them as the following. Unexpected Journey, which is the first one, I would say is a solid W tier. A beefy W for sure. It's worth a watch, and I would argue its only failings is that it takes too much time on everything. Again, they ought to be at the Lonely Mountain, I think, at the end of that first movie. That's my take. But the rewatchability on this one is still there, and I greatly appreciate that, and it is my favorite of the trilogy. Desolation of Smaug is pretty good too. It's an interesting diversion from some storylines, and it gives us more Bilbo, but sadly also more of Thorin Oakenshield as well, which I feel we kind of didn't need. Really, any non-Hobbit-centric storyline of a movie that's called The Hobbit kind of rubs me the wrong way, and maybe that's probably my own issue. But Desolation of Smaug gets a V tier, very average, and it's also something that popped in my head watching back these movies. I feel like with the VFX, I truly believe they tried to make them look good, and they do, in a sense, but with Lord of the Rings, I think they tried to make them look real. And maybe I prefer the realness of Lord of the Rings over to the technical quality of Hobbit. I don't know. Moving on to the final one, Battle of the Five Armies. Literally the title is an event that probably should have had some gravitas compared to the Battle of Helm's Deep or the Plains of Minas Tirith. That is to say, the climax of a movie, not the entirety of a movie. And the digital VFX fails the most on this film. I guess they just bit off more than they could chew, perhaps, and the whole thing leaves me just not caring as much as I want to. What's insane is this movie is also the shortest by 30 minutes, and that says something about how it probably could have been shortened by quite a bit. And I should mention, the last 13 minutes of this movie that's already 30 minutes shorter than the rest is just credits. So Battle of Five Armies is like a soft V tier. I mean, it's still better than King Kong in my opinion, so it's definitely not like a U tier, but I still feel like there are a lot of problems. And yeah, so here we are, another trilogy finished. You're probably thinking right now hey Dan, I can't help but think Peter's done some stuff after the Hobbit trilogy, and it's well past a half an hour. What's up? And that's a valid question, but I thought it fitting, for the sake of covering every film as fully, as more in-depth as I can, I should embrace Peter Jackson's style of trilogies and expand this giant tier list into a third part, covering his last 2 latest projects in another episode. But we will stop here at 2014, at the end of Peter Jackson's second leg of his career, which I kind of consider his blockbuster phase. And when we come back in a couple weeks, I'll be talking about the third phase of his career, which I would put as his documentary phase. We'll be talking about 2 films, 2019's They Shall Not Grow Old, and 2021's Get Back. So, as always, if you want to check out any of the films we talk about on Film And, you can go to my Letterboxd list at DA_N, and if you want to see any of the movies we talked about in the first full seasons of Film And, you can always go to Cranberry 18's, Connor's Letterboxd list, CRAND Barry 18. If you're still listening, thank you very much for coming along this journey, and you will be hearing from me on the next one. Have a good week.
The greatest adventure is there if you're bold. Let go of the moment that life makes you hold.